Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a case that really shook India over a decade ago.
Yeah.
It's the story of Gita Sharma, a young woman who had a lot of dreams, and Gopal Goyal Kanda, who's a very powerful businessman.
Yes.
And our listeners, you sent us in some source material on this
Yeah.
YouTube video
Hmm.
titled "A Mysterious Murder at India's Worst Airline" from Desi Studios.
Okay.
And it's a really tragic story, and we're here to try to help untangle the events
Right.
and understand what happened here.
Yeah. It's a story that shows, I think, some of the darker sides of things like ambition and power
Right.
and how those things can sometimes collide with people's lives
Yeah.
in a really sad way.
Absolutely. So let's start with Geetika.
Okay.
She was a very bright young woman, had a real drive to succeed. She
Yeah.
really wanted to work for an international airline.
Yeah.
And she actually landed a job at MDLR Airlines.
Right.
And rose through the ranks pretty quickly.
And that's actually kind of an interesting point because it ties directly to Gopal Kanda,
Okay.
who was the owner of the airline.
Right.
And according to the source material, he actually watched Ketika's interview
Wow.
through CCTV.
No kidding.
And he insisted on hiring her even though she was underage at the time.
Really? That's kind of strange, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that's pretty unusual, to say the least.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Makes you wonder what his motivations were
Exactly. Right from the start.
right from the get-go.
Was this just, him admiring her talent, or was there something else going on there,
Well-
something a little more troubling?
Yeah,
So, it's definitely something to keep in mind
definitely.
as we learn more about this story.
So let's talk about Kanda.
Okay.
So he had, kind of that classic rags to riches story.
Yeah.
Went from a small-town kid,
Mm-hmm.
built up this huge real estate empire,
Yeah, he owned an airline.
owned an airline,
Okay.
got into politics.
Yeah, his story, I think, is a really interesting one because it really shows how that drive for power
Mm,
can take somebody down a very, very specific path.
right.
And, he built this massive empire, but it definitely came with a certain reputation.
Yeah.
I mean, he was known for having a very extravagant lifestyle.
Yeah.
There were suspicions that he might have had ties to some criminal element.
Right. And he was connected to some pretty powerful politicians, too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
With some pretty controversial pasts themselves.
Yeah. One name that comes up in the source material is Om Prakash Chautala.
Okay.
And he was actually involved in another case that was very high profile,
Okay.
a harassment case.
Mm-hmm.
And this one involved a young woman named Ruchika Girhotra.
I think I remember hearing about that.
Yeah.
That was a huge scandal.
It was a huge scandal.
Yeah.
And, the fact that Kanda was connected to somebody like Chautala,
Right.
I think it adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of suggests that he might have been operating
Right.
within a system where power and influence
Yeah.
could potentially be used to shield people from scrutiny.
It's like this whole case is tied up
Yeah.
with this bigger web of power dynamics and possibly
strongly-
unchecked behavior.
Yeah. That's definitely something that
Yeah.
we need to kind of dig into a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about Kanda as a person,
Right.
right? It's
Uh-huh.
about the systems that might allow these sorts of abuses to happen.
Absolutely. Okay, so we have Gitika,
Yeah.
ambitious-driven,
Mm-hmm.
working for Kanda, who is very powerful and well-connected.
Right.
And then the source kind of hints that their relationship
Yeah.
might have been more than just professional.
Yeah, there were rumors that they were romantically involved.
Right.
He gave her expensive gifts.
Right.
And there was even potentially a pregnancy that Gitika might have terminated.
Wow, that's a pretty big revelation.
Yeah.
But Kanda's wife claimed that he treated Gitika like a daughter, right?
So how do we make sense of these two
Yeah.
completely different versions of their relationship?
Well, I think it's really important to remember that there's a big power imbalance here.
Right.
We're talking about a very powerful man
Yeah.
and a young woman who's just starting out in her career.
Right.
And even if there was some sort of genuine affection between them,
Mm-hmm.
can we really say that it was a relationship between equals?
Right.
That's a big question that I think we need to unpack
Yeah.
as
Well,
we look at this case
for sure.
more deeply.
Yeah. And we'll continue to do that when we come back
Okay.
right after the break.
Yeah, it's a classic case of how power can really distort those lines
Right.
of consent and agency, especially in a work environment.
Yeah.
And then we get to kind of this turning point in the story
Okay.
where Gitika actually achieves her dream
Yeah.
of working for Emirates.
Right.
So you would think happy ending. Right.
Yeah, you would think so.
Like she got out.
Right.
She's away from this guy.
Yeah, a chance to kind of break free.
Yeah.
But that's actually when things take a really dark turn.
Oh, wow.
The source material says that as soon as Gatika left MDLR,
Oh,
Kanda's harassment actually intensified.
really?
He allegedly wrote to Emirates
Wow.
and tried to damage her reputation and get her fired.
So even when she wasn't working for him anymore,
Right.
he still wanted to have that control.
Exactly. It seems like there was some kind of possessiveness there.
Right.
This wasn't just a demanding boss.
Right.
This was a need to control her,
Yeah.
to keep her under his influence.
Oh. And it worked.
And sadly, it did.
Yeah.
Between Kanda's efforts and the pressure that was coming from his associate,
Okay.
Runa Chada Gitika ended up losing her job at Emirates.
That's awful.
I think it's really important here to talk about the psychological impact
Right,
of this
yeah.
kind of harassment. I mean,
Yeah.
imagine the constant fear
Yeah.
knowing that this powerful person is actively trying to sabotage your future. It's like a suffocating feeling. You're trapped. There's no escape.
And so that's what pushes her back
It seems so.
to Kanda's company.
Yeah, her dream job is gone. Her reputation is damaged.
Right.
She probably felt like she had no other choice.
Right.
But to go back to that same environment,
The one she tried to get away from,
the one she tried to escape from, exactly,
it's just awful to think about what she must have been going through.
it is a very sad situation.
And from this point on, it sounds like the harassment just gets worse.
Yeah, it definitely escalates.
The source talks about false accusations and
Right.
threats to her family,
Right.
even forged emails.
Yeah, it was like a systematic attempt to just completely break her down.
Wow.
Kanda and Chada, they use everything they could
Yeah.
to isolate her, to make her feel powerless,
Right.
to discredit her. I mean, they wanted complete control.
Yeah, and that takes us to the worst part of this story.
Right, the climax.
Gitika is found dead,
Yeah.
and she leaves behind these 2 suicide notes.
Yeah.
Directly accusing Kanda and Chada
Right.
of driving her to take her own life.
It's a really tragic reminder, I think,
Yeah.
of just how devastating this kind of abuse can be.
Yeah.
That prolonged harassment, that psychological torture.
Right.
The source actually mentions a handwriting analysis
Okay.
of those notes,
Okay.
and it showed signs of really severe depression
Wow.
and emotional turmoil.
She was clearly in a lot of pain,
Oh, absolutely.
pushed to just the absolute breaking point.
Yeah. So what happens next?
Yeah. Do Kanda and Chada face any consequences?
Well, there was a big legal battle,
Okay.
but it wasn't simple at all.
Go on.
Kanda actually, he tried to avoid arrest at first,
Right.
but he was eventually charged with abetment to suicide,
Okay.
criminal intimidation,
Mm-hmm.
and a bunch of other offenses.
But we have to remember, right?
Yeah,
All those connections he had,
right.
his wealth, his influence.
It seems like that might have played a role
Yeah.
even during the trial. Because even though he was facing some very serious charges,
Right.
Kanda was actually released on bail
Wow.
after only 17 months.
Wow.
And there were even reports of him traveling internationally,
Oh, kidding.
like flaunting his wealth.
While the case was still going on.
While the case was still going on,
Wow.
it seemed like a real display of power
Yeah.
and a complete disregard for the seriousness of the situation.
That's just unbelievable.
Yeah, and then there's another tragic twist in this whole story.
Oh, no.
Gatika's mother, Anuradha, who
Uh-huh.
was a key witness in the case,
Right.
she also committed suicide,
Oh, my God.
and she blamed Kanda and Chada in her suicide notes.
Wow.
And she took her own life in the same room using the same method as her daughter.
That is just devastating.
It's a horrible tragedy.
Yeah.
I mean, a mother driven to despair
Right.
by the loss of her child
Yeah.
and this overwhelming sense of injustice.
Yeah.
I think this case really shows us
Mhm,
that the
mhm.
effects of abuse, they go way beyond just the immediate victim.
Right.
It impacts families, it impacts communities,
Yeah.
and it leaves behind just this trail of devastation.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. So 2 lives are lost, a family is destroyed, and it all comes back to this one man
Right,
and this alleged abuse of power.
right.
But what about the legal case? I mean, were Kanda and Chada ever held accountable?
This is where it gets really complicated.
Okay.
Proving abetment to suicide is incredibly difficult
Okay.
because you have to establish a direct link
Right.
between what the accused did and the victim's decision to end their own life.
So you have to prove that they intended to cause the suicide.
Exactly. You have to show that their actions were the main reason
Right,
that
yeah.
the victim chose to take their own life.
So even with the suicide notes and all the evidence
Yeah.
of the harassment, it's still a really tough legal battle.
Yeah, it is. And in this case,
Yeah.
even though there was so much evidence of the harassment and how much it was hurting Gitika, Kanda and Chada, they were acquitted of all charges.
Wow.
The court just couldn't say for sure that their actions directly caused Gitika's suicide.
It just feels like such an empty victory. I mean,
Right.
they walk free,
Yeah.
but 2 people are dead.
Right.
And a family is left to deal with this unbelievable pain.
It really shows how sometimes the legal system,
Yeah.
it can struggle to understand these
Yeah.
really complex issues of psychological abuse
Yeah.
and manipulation.
Right.
It's hard to capture those invisible wounds,
Yeah.
the really deep impact that these things can have.
It makes you wonder what we can do to change things.
Right.
How can we create a system that actually protects people
Yeah.
and holds people in power accountable?
It's a question that goes beyond this one case. It's
Yeah.
about creating a society
Right.
where people feel safe to speak up
Right.
about abuse without being afraid.
Absolutely.
We need to understand that abuse isn't always physical.
Right.
It can be really sneaky and subtle, but it can do just as much harm.
And the source goes on to talk about what happened after the trial.
Right.
And it sounds like Gitika's family is still dealing with so much pain.
Yeah, they talk about living in constant fear.
Really?
Even after the trial, they were afraid of Kanda's associates.
Wow.
They felt intimidated.
That's awful.
And their home, it's
Yeah.
like a shrine to Gitika.
Wow.
It's frozen in time, a constant reminder of what happened.
It's just heartbreaking.
It really is, and I think it shows us
Yeah.
how long-lasting trauma can be
Yeah.
and how important it is to support victims and their families.
Right. And to create a world where they feel safe,
Absolutely.
to come forward and speak out against abuse.
Exactly.
This has been a really heavy deep dive,
It has.
but it's been so important.
It's been really insightful.
Gita's story is tragic,
It is.
but it's a story that we need to hear.
Yeah, we need to pay attention to these kinds of stories
Absolutely.
and really think about how we can prevent these things from happening.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing this case with us
Of course.
and allowing us to really dig deep into these complex issues.
Absolutely.
Gitika's story is a powerful reminder of the devastating consequences of abuse of power.
Yeah, and how important it is to keep fighting for justice and accountability.
You've given us a lot to think about.
I hope so.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next time for the deep dive.